The plane was ready to take off, and people were settling into their seats when all of a sudden, a flight attendant stalked in front of two young boys in first class. Her face tightened, and soon they were being escorted off the plane, embarrassed in front of everyone. There was no explanation, no warning, just gone. But what she didn't know was that the mistake she just made would come back to haunt her in a way she didn't expect, and by the time she realized the truth, it was too late. Before we start the story, leave a comment below telling us where in the world. If you like these kinds of stories, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The airport was busy with people rushing between terminals and rolling suitcases across polished floors. The sound of boarding announcements could be heard far away in the crowd. Elon and his younger brother Zavin walked toward their gate with their backpacks over their shoulders. They had been very excited ever since their father left. They were surprised with first-class tickets to their trip as a reward for their hard work in school. They were thrilled about it. Alone, the older of the two at 15, carried himself with quiet competence. He was used to taking care of Zavin, who was 13 and had boundless energy that made every moment an adventure. When they got to the boarding area, Elon gave both of their tickets to the gate agent. The woman scanned them without a second glance and gave them a polite nod. "You're all set, enjoy your flight." JetBridge was excited as they got closer to the plane. The cool air inside the plane was a nice change from the crowded terminal. The air smelled like fresh coffee, and there was a steady hum of quiet conversations in the first-class cabin. As they settled in, a flight attendant checked their seat numbers, 2A and 2B, and led Zavin to his seat. As soon as they were settled in, Zavin smiled and reached for the entertainment screen. "This is crazy," he whispered, pressing buttons with excitement. "We've never had seats this big before," Elian laughed. As more people got on the plane, a flight attendant walked down the aisle to check seat numbers. Milora Cartwright had been working on flights for over 15 years and was proud of how efficiently she made sure things ran smoothly. She wasn't the friendliest crew member, but she knew how to keep order. Her sharp eyes scanned the cabin to make sure everything was in order, and then she saw the two boys sitting comfortably in first class by themselves. She stopped walking because something about the sight made her stop. She took a step closer with her arms crossed and said, "Excuse me," in a polite but firm voice. "Are you two in the right seats?" Elon looked up, confused. "Yes, we have first-class tickets," she said. "Where are your parents?" Melora asked. "They're traveling alone," Zavin replied. "I see," she said, pressing her lips together. Alan reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out his boarding pass. He said, handing it over to me. Zavin did the same. Melora took the tickets, but something. She looked doubtful as she held on to the items longer than necessary, turned them over and looked at them again, and then handed them back without saying a word. "I'll be right back," she said as she turned and walked toward the front of the cabin. Elon frowned as he watched her leave, saying something under his breath. Zavin shifted in his seat. "Why do I get the feeling that she doesn't think the other people on the plane noticed?" Some looked at each other, while others kept their heads down to pretend not to hear the first-class cabin witch. Several minutes later, Melora came back with another crew member, Bennett, the senior flight attendant. He walked with authority, but his face couldn't be read. "We need you both to come with us," Melora said, raising her voice. This time, Elon sat up straighter and asked, "What's wrong?" "There's been a mistake with your seating." She said this while losing her patience. "You need to move," Zavin said, his face falling. "We have first-class tickets," he repeated, his voice lower this time. Bennett cleared the way. Elon clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. He knew that arguing wouldn't help, so he took a deep breath and grabbed his backpack. Zavin hesitated before doing the same. As they stood there, the energy in the cabin changed. People watched, but didn't say anything. Some people avoided looking at them altogether, while others stole glances, but quickly turned their attention back to their magazines or phones. Melora led them down the aisle toward the exit, her posture stiff and her face serious. As Elon and Zavin walked past the rows of people staring at them, Lydia, a member of the ground staff, was already waiting for them and motioning them to a nearby seating area. As soon as they got off the plane, Zavin pulled out his phone and typed a quick message with shaking fingers. They made us leave our seats and said there was a mistake, but we had our tickets. He hit send with his stomach twisting, and almost right away, his dad asked him what flight number Elon. After reading the message, he let out a slow breath and muttered, "I'm going to be mad." Zavin nodded, really mad. On the plane, Melora went back to the first-class cabin and wiped her hands clean, as if she had just dealt with a small problem. She gave Bennett a short nod and said, "Problem solved." She added that she didn't know that the choice she had just made was going to change everything. The airport terminal felt colder than before, and Elian and Zavin sat in stiff chairs near the gate, their backpacks resting at their feet. A steady stream of people moved through the terminal. Others were just waiting around, not knowing what had happened. Zavin kept looking at his phone, hoping for another message from their father. Elon, on the other hand, sat quietly, his jaw clenched, going over everything in his mind. "She didn't even check properly," Zavin muttered, his fingers drumming anxiously against his leg. "She just looked at us and decided we didn't belong." Elon let out a slow breath, his mind working through the situation. "She didn't even question anyone else in first class," he said. As Ian spoke, his grip on his phone got tighter. "Do you think Dad is going to?" he asked himself. Before he could finish, his phone vibrated, and he quickly unlocked it and read the new message. "Dad, stay where you are. I'll handle it." Elon read over Zavin's shoulder and leaned back in his seat, which meant she was in trouble. Zavin smiled slightly. Back on the plane, Melora Cartwright moved through the first-class cabin, checking overhead bins and making small changes. To her, the situation was already over. She wed with her bet, and that was the end of it for her. She looked at the people she had talked to earlier and smiled professionally. "Sorry for the delay," she said. "We had to clear up a seating issue, but everything is taken care of now." A few people nodded politely, but some still looked confused. A woman in seat 3D asked an older woman in a navy blue blazer, "Weren't they supposed to be here?" Melora straightened up. "It was just a misunderstanding," she said quickly. The woman wasn't sure, but she didn't say anything else. At the front of the plane, Captain Audrey Ball was going over flight details with his co-pilot when the phone next to him rang. He picked it up expecting a normal check-in, but instead heard a low, serious voice. "This is Dorian Vance, Executive Manager of Airline Operations. We just received a direct call from the CEO's office." Aldrich's grip on the receiver tightened a bit. "Go ahead and do what you need to do." A flight attendant had just taken 2 unaccompanied minors from first class. The cabin door suddenly became aware of how quiet it was outside. He had been told about the unaccompanied minors on the flight, but not about any seating problems. "I wasn't aware of any removals." Audrey admitted. "Well, it happened," and Dorian said in a clipped voice, "and the CEO is on his way to the airline's operations center right now." Ulrich's eyes narrowed as Dorian confirmed that Darius Langford and those 2 boys were his sons. There was a heavy pause, and Audrey leaned back in his seat and let out a breath. Audrey asked, "Who was responsible for this?" The report says a senior flight attendant named Melora Cartwright. Audrey agreed, saying he had worked with her before and was efficient, experienced, and unbending. "He then put me through to her, telling me, 'Dorian, don't hesitate. Already done, you'll want to handle this quickly.'" Audrey put down the phone and pressed the button for the in-flight announcement system. His voice came over the speakers. "Miss Cartwright, report to the cockpit immediately." Some passengers looked up at the announcement, and Melora felt something she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of doubt. She turned on her heel and made her way toward the front of the plane, straightening her uniform as she went. She had no idea what was waiting for her behind that door, but she was about to find out. Melora stepped into the cockpit, and with a quiet click, the door shut behind her. Captain Audrey Baugh sat in his chair, his posture straighter than usual, and his expression couldn't be read. There was a lot of tension in the room. He didn't greet her like he usually would. Instead, he leaned forward a little and clasped his hands together. "Miss Cartwright," he began, "I need an explanation." Melora kept her back straight, her years of experience making it easy to hide the unease that was creeping into her chest. "Sir, there was a seating issue in first class," she said. "Equally 2 unaccompanied minors were in premium seats. Given the circumstances, I made the call to remove them and reassign their seats." Aldrich's eyes never left hers. "And what were those circumstances?" Melora hesitated for a second, but quickly answered, "They were traveling alone," which seemed out of place. "I wasn't told there were any minors traveling in first class, and I had to act quickly." Audrey took a slow breath and asked, "Did you check the manifest?" Melora felt the air in the cockpit get heavier. Aldrich's jaw tightened as he asked, "Did you verify their tickets with the gate agent?" "I looked at the tickets," she said, her voice quieter now, but Audrey shook his head. "You didn't verify," she said, "you assumed." Melora's throat went dry. Audrey didn't raise his voice, but his words were strong. "The 2 passengers you removed from first class were Kenzo Alan Langford and Xavier Darius Langford. Do you know who their father is?" Her pulse quickened. "Darius Langford is the CEO of this airline," Audrey said. "Right now, Darius Langford is personally reviewing this situation. You have caused an incident that will affect this flight and could have serious consequences for the airline." Melora tried to swallow hard but couldn't because her throat was dry. Aldrich's next words came slowly and deliberately. "You will personally apologize to the boys and escort them back to their original seats in first class." She opened her mouth to argue that she had only been doing her job, but the look in Aldrich's eyes told her that this wasn't up for debate. Melora clenched her fists together and forced a nod. "Yes, Captain." "Then fix your mistake," he said, turning away from her. She felt the heat in her face as she turned on her heel and stepped out of the cockpit. As soon as the door shut behind her, she let out a slow breath and her hands started to shake slightly. The passengers continued to settle in, unaware of what had just happened behind the cockpit door, but Melora felt the shift. For the first time in her career, she wasn't in charge and she didn't know what was going on. When the plane landed, Melora walked stiffly down the aisle, her heart racing like it hadn't in years. She had dealt with difficult customers, strict bosses, and high-pressure situations before, but nothing like this. As soon as she walked back into the first-class cabin, she could feel the change in energy. Some people had heard the captain's announcement, while others had seen how she had helped 2 young boys get off the plane minutes before and were now watching her to see what would happen. Zavin sat with his arms crossed and stared down at his phone, while Aeon sat up straight with an expression that couldn't be read. They hadn't talked much since their father's message, but they knew something was going on. Melora stopped in front of him and forced a tight smile. She knelt down a bit to meet their eye level and spoke more quietly than before. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said in a measured but strained tone. "I'd like to take you both back to your original seats in first class," she said. Savannah looked up from her phone. Elon looked at her closely and asked, "What changed?" Lorena's jaw tightened as she quickly avoided eye contact and said, "I'm sorry for the trouble." Zavin blinked and tilted his head, saying, "Your mistake was repeated, but you saw our tickets." Island didn't let her off easily, saying, "You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket, you just asked us." The cabin was quiet as people listened, some moving slightly in their seats and pretending not to be paying attention. As Melora pressed her lips together, she felt the weight of her decision. She had been in charge for years, never second-guessed or questioned, but now she was in front of 2 boys who weren't letting her escape. "I may have misjudged the situation," she said, forcing herself to stay calm. "But I'd like to correct it now." Elon looked at Zavin and then back at her. "You didn't just misjudge, you embarrassed us in front of everyone." Melora swallowed the heat in. Her face lit up again. She wanted to end the conversation quickly, move on, and act like it never happened. But the moment was going on longer than she had planned, and people weren't pretending to ignore them anymore. A woman in seat 3D shed uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Melora and the boys. A man in seat 4A adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. The uncomfortable truth had spread through the cabin. Everyone had seen what happened, and no one had said anything. Zayden leaned back slightly and crossed his arms. His dad told us to take our time. Saying to Elon, maybe we shouldn't be in such a hurry. Elon gave her a small smirk and agreed, maybe we should make sure we actually belong here first. Melora clenched her teeth and kept her voice level. I understand if you're upset, she said, choosing her words carefully. But I need you both to go back to your seats. Zayden held up his phone and said, maybe I should ask Dad first. This made Melora's stomach tighten. Passengers murmured. Melora let out a sharp breath and took a small step back. Of course, she said stiffly, give me a moment. She turned on her heel and walked toward the galley, her hands cold and clammy. She had never felt so helpless before. At the same time, Airline leaned over to Zayden and said, send him a message. Zayden nodded and quickly typed, Zayden, she wants us to come back. What do we do? Their father replied, Dad, make sure she understands what she did. Airline smiled and slid his phone into his pocket. Sorry, we weren't in a hurry after all. The situation had changed. Melora stood in the galley, holding on to the edge of the counter, her breathing shallow. She could still feel the passengers' eyes on her, and their whispers carried through the cabin like an invisible weight pressing down on her. She had always been in charge, making sure things ran smoothly, but now, for the first time in her career, she wasn't. Elon and Zayden stayed in the economy section, refusing to move. Elon leaned back in his chair. Zayden tapped his fingers on the armrest while scrolling through his phone with a smug face. Neither of them was in a hurry. Zayden looked at his screen and laughed, he's still texting. Elon gave a small smirk. What did he say? Zayden read the message out loud to his dad. She made a choice, and now she has to live with it. Don't move until she actually apologizes. Airline raised an eyebrow, not just an apology, an actual apology. Zayden grinned, I like his style. Hesitantly stepped closer to Melora and asked, are you okay? Melora shot her a sharp look and said, I don't need your concern. Helma held up her hands and surrendered. I was just asking. She leaned against the counter and watched Melora closely. You know this isn't going away, right? Melora said, it was a misunderstanding. Helma laughed. Misunderstanding, she said. You didn't question a single other person in first class, just them. Helma continued, I guess she thought they didn't belong. You assumed something. Melora didn't answer, but Helma sighed and shook her head. I've worked under you long enough to know you don't like being wrong, but this is a whole other level of bad. Melora set the tray down with a little too much force. I already spoke to them. How did that go? Halima asked, folding her arms. Melora gave her a dirty look and turned toward the aisle. I'll handle it, Halima said under her breath. Melora straightened her uniform and walked back down the aisle toward Elon and Zayden. Both of them looked up as she approached, but neither of them moved. She cleared her throat and asked, are you ready to go back to your seats? Elon leaned back, his arms resting comfortably on the armrests. Are you ready to actually apologize? Zayden raised an eyebrow and said, that's not an apology. Melora let out a sharp breath and looked around at the people watching her. She hated feeling like she had lost. She was in charge of the situation, but she could see that their father's message had given them the upper hand, and they weren't going to give in until she did this the right way. She kept her voice down and met their gaze. I shouldn't have assumed you weren't supposed to be in first class, she said. I was wrong. Zavi tilted his head to say, I apologize. Melora clenched her jaw for questioning your tickets and making you leave your seats. Elon finally nodded and pushed himself up from his seat. Everyone on the flight was watching them as they walked back down the aisle. This time, the other passengers didn't just ignore them, they saw everything. When they got to their first-class seats, Elian sat down and adjusted his seatbelt, and Zayden leaned over to him and whispered, Dad's going to love this update. Melora turned to leave, but Ellen's voice stopped her. Oh, and Miss Cartwright? Ellen's voice was calm, but there was a hint of anger in her voice. There was no denying the seriousness of his words. If you're going to apologize, make sure it's not just because you got caught. Melora looked at him for one more second before turning away, her face burning. This was the first time in her career that she wasn't giving orders, and she hated it. Melora walked quickly back to the galley, her heart pounding in her chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. She knew that as soon as she turned around, the whispers would begin again. The passengers had seen everything, and they had seen her make a snap decision. Embarrassing two boys, and then having to go back when she realized who they were. She went to the galley and leaned against the counter, taking deep breaths. Helma was still there, watching with a smile on her face. So how'd that go? Melora asked her. Not now, Helma replied. I'll take that as a terrible insult. Melora ignored her and grabbed a stack of cups, pretending to be busy, but her hands were shaking. Helma leaned against the counter and folded her arms. You still don't get it, do you? Melora asked. Helma raised an eyebrow and laughed. You think this is handled? You kicked two kids out of first class based on your own assumptions and made them walk back through the cabin like they had done something wrong, and now you think an apology will erase that? Melora pressed her lips together and didn't answer. How Lima wouldn't let up on the fact that they had to demand an apology. That tells you everything you need to know. Melora turned her back on her while pretending to organize. Helma let out a dry laugh and said, Oh, you're going to get one whether you like it or not. She tilted her head toward the first class section because she knew Darius Langford and wasn't going to let this go. Miora didn't have to ask because she already knew him. She could still feel the heat rising in her cheeks. On any other flight, a mistake like this might have been ignored with a simple report and a warning, but the CEO's sons were involved, and the whole company was about to find out about it. Back in first class, Xavier pulled out his phone and quickly glanced at the screen. Island looked at him and smirked, updating him. Zaven nodded. Of course Zaven, she finally said sorry. It had taken her too long. A few seconds later, their father's reply came through. Dad, good, sit back and relax. I'll take care of the rest. Elan raised an eyebrow as he read the message over Xavier's shoulder. That doesn't sound good for her, I mean. Zaven smiled. Nope. At the front of the plane, Melora froze. Helma gave her a slow nod, which meant it was him. Laura's stomach twisted as she reached for the phone, and her hand was shaking as she lifted it to her ear. A deep, calm voice answered, This is Darius Langford. Laura's breath caught in her throat as she said it. You and I need to talk. Melora swallowed hard and gripped the phone tightly. The hum of the plane felt far away, drowned out by the weight of the voice on the other end. Darius Langford didn't sound angry. He didn't sound. It was the kind of calm that was more dangerous than yelling, Mr. Langford. She tried to keep her voice steady as she said, You took my sons out of first class without checking their tickets properly. Darius cut her off. You didn't verify anything you assumed. Melora felt her throat tighten. Sir, I understand that you don't, he said. If you did, this conversation wouldn't be happening. There was a heavy silence between them. Melora clenched her fingers around the phone cord. This wasn't someone looking for an excuse or a scripted response. It was the owner of the airline demanding accountability. I've already apologized to them, she said, trying to regain some control as she led them back to first class. Darius let out a slow, unimpressed breath, and Melora blinked. You think that's enough? He asked, his voice unreadable. You think that a forced apology fixes what you did? Melora felt the pressure building in her chest. It was a choice, not a mistake, she said, her voice getting quieter. Melora flinched a little. You didn't ask anyone else to prove they belonged in first class, Darius continued. You didn't check the manifest, you didn't call the gate agent, you didn't even stop to think that you were the one who made a mistake. Melora didn't say anything because she knew it wouldn't make things sound better. My sons don't need your permission to sit in first class, Darius said, his voice dropping. If they followed the rules, you broke them. Melora's breath got short. She had never felt this way in her 15 years in the field. She knew every rule and every policy, and yet she was being exposed. "Do you understand what happens next?" Darius asked. Melora's mouth felt dry. "Mr. Langford, I promise you're going to file a full incident report as soon as this flight lands. I want to see exactly what went through your mind when you broke the rules." Laura's heart was racing as she heard Darius's voice drop to a cold finality. "You're going to explain yourself in front of the executive board." The blood left her face as he said this. "The same board that decides whether or not you keep your job," he said. "I suggest you use the rest of this flight to think very carefully about how you're going to justify what you did," he added. Click, the call ended, and Melora stood there frozen, the receiver still pressed. She held the phone to her ear and heard the low hum of the disconnected line. She couldn't move. Halma, who had been watching the whole thing, raised an eyebrow and asked, "How'd that go?" Melora slowly put the phone back on the hook, her hands sweating. She turned and walked straight to the nearest bathroom, locking the door behind her. She gripped the sink and stared at her pale reflection in the mirror. For the first time, the truth of what she had done hit her. She had embarrassed the sons of the most powerful people in the world. Melora splashed cold water on her face while holding on to the small sink in the bathroom. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she didn't recognize the competent, in-charge flight attendant she had always been. She had made a serious mistake, and now the weight of it was crushing her like never before. She had thought that saying sorry would be enough to make things right, and that a quiet return to first class would settle the matter, but it hadn't. Darius Langford. She wasn't going to let this go, and deep down she knew it wasn't just about his sons. It was about every passenger she had unfairly judged over the years, every time she had let her assumptions guide her decisions. The only difference this time was that she had picked the wrong people to treat unfairly. A sharp knock on the door startled her. It was Bennett, the senior flight attendant. "We need you back out here." She swallowed and steadied her breath before unlocking the door. When she stepped out, Bennett's face was hard to read. He spoke in a low voice, leading her away from the other flight attendants. "We just got word from ground control that security is waiting at the gate when we land." This made Lorena's stomach twist violently, and she echoed Bennett's words, "Security is waiting at the gate when we land." Bennett nodded, but not for an emergency, but for an escort. He hesitated before adding, "For you." Lorena stared at him, and Bennett looked around, lowering his voice even more. Langford made a personal request, which made Lorena's breath hitch. This wasn't going to be taken lightly, it was serious. "How bad is this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice level. Bennett let out a sigh of relief. "They're calling a review hearing right after we land, which doesn't happen unless the company is thinking about taking serious action." Melora felt her throat tighten. She had worked for the airline for 15 years and put everything she had into her job. Now it could all be gone because of one mistake she hadn't thought about twice until it was too late. She looked into the first-class cabin. Elian and Zavan were contently sitting in their seats and scrolling through their phones. They weren't bragging or even looking in her direction, but they didn't need to. They had already won. Lima walked closer and studied Melora's face with crossed arms. It was starting to sink in, wasn't it? Melora clenched her jaw and said, "I'll handle it." Halma laughed and said, "Handle it? You still don't get it. This isn't about handling it. This is about what happens when someone with real power decides to hold you." Melanie's fists clenched at her sides. She wasn't used to feeling helpless, but now she was stuck in the results of her own actions, and she had done this to herself. Bennett looked at his watch and said, "We land in 30 minutes. You should probably start thinking about what you're going to say." Melanie stiffly nodded, but her mind was already racing for the first time in her career. She wasn't sure what she could say to fix this. The last 30 minutes of the flight felt like. Lorena's mind was filled with possible explanations, excuses, or ways to lessen the damage every second, but the reality was crushing her. There was no way out of this. She stood near the galley, gripping the counter, and stared blankly at the service card in front of her. Lima Bennett and the rest of the crew knew what was going to happen. No one said it out loud, but she could feel it in their sideways glances and the way they moved around her as if she were already gone. Over the intercom, Captain Aldrich's voice came through calmly but firmly. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please ensure that your seatbelts are fastened and that your tray tables are in their upright positions. We will be landing shortly. Melora took a sharp breath and looked over at Elian and Zaven in first class. They were sitting comfortably, their faces blank. They hadn't said a word to her since she put them back in their seats, but she could tell they were watching, not out of spite or anger, but with the quiet confidence of knowing they had already won. Zaven leaned toward his seat. Loila's stomach dropped when she saw her brother whisper something before unlocking his phone and typing another message. She knew who he was texting, Darius Langford, and she was sure that whatever he was telling their father would only make things worse for her. A few rows back, a businessman in seat 4A adjusted his tie awkwardly. He was one of many people who had seen everything happen earlier but had chosen not to say anything. As Melora passed him, he finally spoke. I hope you learned something from this. He said this without even looking at her, and Melora stiffened from across the aisle. The woman in seat 3D, who had asked her questions earlier, shook her head and said quietly, the world is changing, and you should have changed with it. Melora felt heat rush to her face. It wasn't just about Darius Langford anymore. Everyone on this flight knew what she had done and wasn't waiting to see what happened to her when they landed. They were ready for it. The fastened seatbelt sign went off, and Melora moved stiffly back to the galley. Hal Lima stood next to her with his arms crossed and said, I still think you can handle it. Melora didn't answer because, for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure she could. As the plane dipped lower to prepare for landing, the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, and people adjusted their seatbelts and peered out the windows to see the approaching runway. For most of them, this was just another flight ending, but for Melora, it was the. In the galley, she stood with her fingers clenched on the counter, knowing that every second was another step closer to whatever punishment she was about to face. She could already picture it, walking off the plane, through security, and into the hushed whispers of airline staff as she was pulled aside. Would she be fired on the spot? Would she be given a chance to explain herself? There was no way to explain what she had done. She had made a choice that wasn't out of desperation. She was about to pay for it in front of everyone in first class. Elon adjusted his seatbelt while keeping his phone in his lap and waiting for the last message from his father. Zaven, on the other hand, was having fun. He smirked slightly as he scrolled through his phone, picturing the scene that would happen when they landed. Do you think he's waiting for us? Zaven asked, nudging his brother Leon. Yes, I do, Leon replied. And I don't think he's alone. Zaven's smile grew. She's about to. The galley Miura overheard them and her stomach turned. Hal Lima noticed how pale Laura's face was and how her body tensed at the sound of Zaven's voice. She let out a dry laugh and shook her head. You're scared? Laura's eyes snapped to her. I am not. Al Lima raised an eyebrow and pointed to first class, saying, those two are worried about a fame. They're sitting back, relaxing, knowing that their dad is about to handle this in a way you never saw coming. Laura's heart beat faster. Hal Lima slightly tilted his head and asked Melora how many times the airline owner had asked for an explanation for why you embarrassed his kids in public. Melora didn't answer, and the cabin became eerily quiet as the plane made its final approach. Passengers straightened up in their seats and gripped the armrests as the plane hovered just above the runway. The landing was smooth, and the wheels touched down with a gentle bounce. The engines roared as the plane slowed down, and the lights. The intercom cracked again, and some passengers let out relieved sighs. For most people on board, the flight was over, but for Melora, it was just getting started. The voice of Captain Aldrich came through, steady as ever. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us today. As soon as the announcement ended, Melora saw it through the small hole in the galley curtain. As the jet bridge moved into place, a group of men in dark suits stood just outside the window. It was hard for her to breathe. These men weren't airport security or random executives. They were personal staff from the CEO's office, Darius Langford, waiting for first-class passengers. The murmur started right away as Elian looked out the window and smiled. Zovin let out a quiet laugh, and Zavin whispered, "That's it." The fastened seatbelt sign went off, and the plane doors opened soon. When they did, Melora had nowhere to hide. Bennett walked up to her, his face blank and his voice unreadable. "They're waiting for you," Bennett said. Melora's heart raced, and she forced herself to breathe. She had always thought she was in charge and had power, but she had never been more wrong. As soon as the seatbelt sign went off, there was silence on the plane. Usually, people would rush to stand and grab their bags from the overhead bins, eager to leave, but this time, no one moved. Lorena's hands were icy cold as she steadied herself on the galley cart and tried to think of what she could say or how she could defend herself when the man waiting for her owned the company she worked for. Through the small window in the cabin door, she could see 3 men in dark suits standing just outside the jet bridge with their arms crossed and earpieces in their ears. They weren't normal airline staff, they were Langford's people, and they were here for. The passengers finally got up, sat down, and stretched their legs, but their eyes kept darting to the front of the plane. The tension was building, and Elon took his time unbuckling his seat belt. He wasn't in a hurry. Zovin, on the other hand, was already standing and rolling his shoulders like he was getting ready for a show. "I can't wait to see her face," Zovin said to his brother Elon. "She already knows from the galley." Melora heard them, and for the first time since the ordeal, she felt something she hadn't felt before. Panicked, Bennett appeared next to her, his face blank. "You need to go out there," he said, but Melora didn't move. Bennett let out a sharp breath and looked away. "It's not going to change anything. You made a bad call. Now you have to face it." Melora clenched her jaw and said, "I was doing my job." Bennett gave her a long, tired look. "Were you?" Melora's throat tightened as the cabin doors opened. A quiet hiss filled the air as the door cracked open and the jet bridge was fully connected. A uniformed security officer stepped in first, then right. Behind him came a man in a charcoal suit who was calm and collected. He dominated the small entryway, and the whole plane seemed to hold its breath. Melora knew who he was: Dorian Vance Langford's right-hand man, head of airline operations, and the man who dealt with internal problems before they became public scandals. He was here for her. Dorian stepped forward, and as soon as they met, Melora's stomach dropped. Passengers stared, and flight attendants held their breath. Still, Dorian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You'll need to come with us," he said in a smooth, polite, but firm voice. Melora's fingers were clenched into fists at her sides, and she could feel every eye in the cabin on her. Lima was watching with her arms folded and her expression unreadable. Bennett shifted uncomfortably next to her, but he didn't say anything. And then there were the passengers. Some tried to act like they weren't listening by scrolling through their phones, while others watched the woman in seat 3D. The woman who had questioned Melora's actions earlier pressed her lips together. The businessman in seat 4A, who had muttered something at her before landing, shook his head slightly, showing his disappointment. Everyone knew what was going on. Melora had been judged and was about to be sentenced. For a brief, desperate moment, she thought about making a scene, arguing, and defending herself by saying she was just following the rules and that this was all a misunderstanding, but she knew it wouldn't matter because Dorian wasn't there. Without saying a word, Melora stepped forward. As soon as she did, rumors spread like wildfire through the cabin. This was it. She was being led off the plane. As she walked down the aisle, passengers moved out of the way. Some refused to look her in the eyes, while others watched intently and whispered to each other. Elon sat calmly and did not say a word, while Zovin smirked slightly, not out of cruelty, but because justice had been done. When Melora reached the front of the plane, she hesitated, she turned a little, and she was sure that the 2 boys didn't belong in those seats in first class, but now she had to leave. Dorian pointed toward the jet bridge and said, "After you," and Melora got off the plane with one last breath. She was gone. As soon as Melora got off the plane, there were whispers throughout the cabin. It was like an unspoken tension had suddenly been broken, causing a shift in energy that everyone could feel. Some people looked at each other, while others spoke in low tones. Putting together what they had just seen, they saw that she had been taken off the flight and escorted by security. Lima, who was still standing near the galley, took a slow breath and shook her head. "Wow," she said under her breath. Bennett ran his hand down Bennett's face, exhaling. "That was brutal." In first class, Elian adjusted his watch and remained calm as usual. Zavin, on the other hand, was grinning. "That," he whispered to his brother, "was worth every second." Aeon smiled. "She didn't see it coming." "She thought she had power," Zavin said, shaking his head. "But she didn't." Elian tapped his shoulder. Zavin raised an eyebrow and asked, "Do you think he'll fire her?" Elian thought for a moment and then shrugged. "I think he'll make sure she never forgets this flight." Outside the plane, Miura walked down the jet bridge with her heart racing. She could feel Dorian Vance following her, his presence heavy and measured. He wasn't rushing her because he didn't need to. At the end of the jet bridge, 2 more men in suits stood waiting. One held a tablet and the other held a folder. Laura's breath felt tight. Dorian blocked her path as soon as she got to the open terminal. He didn't raise his voice or look angry, but Miss Cartwright could tell he was serious. "You will come with us to the executive office," he said. Melora forced herself to breathe. "Am I?" she asked herself. "Will I be given a chance to explain my side?" Dorian didn't blink. "You'll be given a chance to submit a formal statement, but I'd choose your words carefully." Bora clenched her fists. Dorian's face didn't change as he said, "I've worked for this airline for 15 years, and in one flight you hurt the company's reputation, turned off premium customers, and made a decision that has now reached the highest levels of corporate review." He tilted his head. "That's impressive in a way." Melora felt her stomach drop. She had been expecting consequences, like a suspension or a quiet rep, but she hadn't expected to become a public example. Dorian turned slightly and motioned toward the hallway. "Let's go." Melora wasn't sure what to do. She knew she had to do what was next, because her career and future depended on it. She walked toward Dorian, and the 2 suited men surrounded her. They didn't touch her or push her, but it was clear she wasn't in charge anymore. Back on the plane, people were still talking about what had happened when the announcement came over the speakers. "This is your captain speaking." The plane had reached the gate, and the crew would soon start deaning. "Thank you for flying with us today," Xavier stretched. Elon nodded, stood up, and grabbed his backpack. He looked at the other flight attendants, but none of them dared look him in the eyes as they walked toward the exit. A few passengers stepped to the side to give them space, and some even gave them small nods of respect. It wasn't just about what had happened with Melora, it was about what it meant. No matter how hard they worked or how much money they made, people like them had to prove they belonged. People would always wonder if they deserved to be there, but today, someone else had to answer for their actions, and everyone could see it. As they got off the plane, a familiar figure waited for them at the terminal entrance. It was Darius Langford, their father. Zavin Brandon said, "Showtime." Elon smirked and said, "Let's see how this goes." As they walked forward, their father's eyes met theirs, and they knew this wasn't over yet. Darius Langford stood with his hands in his. His face was blank as his sons walked up to him. His shark suit, precise posture, and quiet intensity that never had to be loud to be heard were enough to get people's attention. Behind him, several corporate executives and senior airline staff stood waiting, their faces tight with unease. They knew exactly why they were there. Elon and Zavin walked forward slowly, carrying the same calmness their father did. They weren't nervous, they didn't have to be. As soon as they got to him, Darius took a long, thoughtful look at both of them. "Are you good?" he asked simply. "Yes," Elam replied, and Zavin smiled even bigger. Darius held their gazes for another moment before turning his attention to the group of airline executives standing behind him. One of them, a man with silver-rimmed glasses who looked nervous, stepped forward and said, "Mr. Langford, we sincerely apologize for." Darius held up a hand, and the man immediately shut his mouth. There was a slow, heavy silence in the terminal. Everyone was watching, not just airline employees and passengers. They looked up from their phones and whispered to each other that it wasn't often that the CEO of the airline showed up in person to handle a situation. Darius let the silence last for a long time before finally speaking. "Where is she?" he asked. The men in suits exchanged uneasy looks. "She's on her way to the executive office," one of them answered carefully. "Good," Darius nodded. He then looked back at his sons, as if looking for signs of frustration or anger. But Elon and Zavin stood with the same calm, measured confidence he had. Before he spoke again, Darius let out a sharp breath and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I want to make something very clear," he said, "not just to my staff, but to everyone in this airport right now." The tension rose instantly. "This isn't about two boys getting up from their seats," he said. "This is about the fact that no matter how much success, education, or wealth you have, there will always be someone who looks at you and decides you don't belong here." A few executives shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up, so Darius looked at his sons and said, "Today that someone was one of my employees, and today that someone learned that accountability applies to everyone." Zodin grinned, and Elon smirked. They weren't just watching justice happen, they were a part of it. Darius turned back to the executives and said, "I expect a full investigation into not only this incident, but also the overall training of all crew members. I want to have a report on my desk by morning." His voice dropped a little, and he said, "If I find out that if this wasn't an isolated problem, then the next person to lose their job won't be a flight attendant, but someone sitting in an office." No one spoke, they all knew better. Darius finally turned to his sons again and said, "Let's go with that." He walked past the executives, with his sons following along easily. They didn't need to hear anything else, they had already won. In the executive office, Melora sat in a cold, modern conference room with her hands folded in her lap. A long glass table stretched toward the far end of the room, where two people, senior airline officials, were looking through a thick folder. She could feel the weight of their judgment on her, the silent calculation going on in their minds. She wasn't just any flight attendant anymore, she was a liability. The executive sitting next to her, Nathaniel Clark, finally looked up. His gaze was sharp and unreadable. "You've been with the airline for 15 years with not a single major complaint on your record," he said. Melora nodded stiffly. "That's right." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair and said, "And yet today, you made a call that got you kicked off your own flight by corporate security," Melora said, swallowing hard. "It was a mistake," Nathaniel said, not blinking. "I misjudged the situation," Melora said, keeping her back straight. Nathaniel looked briefly at the woman sitting next to him, another executive named Amara Wells. "We have to ask," Amara said in a smooth but firm voice. "Did you ask anyone else in first class to show their tickets?" Melora hesitated. The silence grew. Amara's face didn't change, that was a yes or no question. Lorena's fists got tighter under the table as she said, "No." Nathaniel let out a small sigh and tapped the folder in front of him. "You didn't verify the manifest. You didn't check with the date agent. You assumed that two unaccompanied young black boys in first class didn't belong there." He closed the folder and said, "That's not a mistake, Miss Cartwright. That's a decision." Lorena's mouth felt dry. "I didn't mean that." Amara spoke in because she never asked anyone else a question. Nathaniel leaned forward and said, "You were one of the most senior flight attendants on that flight. That means you set the example, and today the example you set was that rules only apply to some people." Melora felt sick because for years she had followed rules, policies, and procedures without question, but now she was sitting in front of people who had already decided her fate. Nathaniel breathed out, "We're still going over how this will be handled, but I can tell you that." As Amara looked toward the security guard standing by the door, Melora felt a cold weight settle in her chest. Escort Miss Cartwright off the premises for now, the guard said, tightening Melora's throat. Not suspended, not written up, escorted, she said, meaning she was being taken out of the building. Melora stood slowly, her legs shaking. The guard opened the door for her, and as soon as she stepped out, she wasn't just a flight attendant anymore, she was the woman who had embarrassed Amara. The cold air outside the corporate office felt different as Melora stepped outside. Her body was stiff and her movements were robotic. The stress of the last few hours had settled over her like a heavy blanket, she had lost control of everything. The security officer, a middle-aged man with a neutral expression, didn't touch her or say a word, but his presence was enough. She didn't need to be escorted physically because the humiliation had already done its job. She stepped onto the sidewalk and blinking as the bright sun hit her. The afternoon sun hit her face, and the sounds of the city continued around her, cars honking, people walking by, and life going on as if nothing had happened. For a split second, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She thought about ignoring it, but her curiosity won out, and she pulled it out. When she saw the notification, her heart dropped. Breaking news, airline executive Darius Langford addresses first-class incident involving son's Melora's stomach has been twisted. The first picture she saw was of Darius Langford standing in the airport terminal with his two sons on either side of him. The headline below it made her cold. No one should have to prove they belong where they already are. As she scrolled, her fingers shook as the article told her about the whole incident in a calm but accusatory tone. It talked about how two young black passengers were taken from their first-class seats without proper identification and how the flight attendant responsible was let off the plane. At the very bottom was a statement from Darius Langford himself. My sons did not need to prove their right to sit in first class. Their presence was enough, but someone on my airline, a place where fairness and professionalism should be absolute, chose to believe otherwise. This is not just about two passengers. It's about a culture that lets things like this happen over and over again without being checked. Today, Melora felt things would be different. She felt sick to her stomach because her name wasn't in the article, but it didn't need to be. Everyone who had seen it knew exactly who it was, and now everyone knew what she had done. She looked up from her phone, her breath uneven. A few feet away, near the entrance to the corporate building, a group of airline employees were standing in a circle with their heads down on their phones. She didn't have to guess what they were reading. One of them looked up, her eyes meeting Mora's for a split second, and then she turned away without saying anything. Lorena's chest swelled up in pain. She had always been proud of being respected, having authority, and being someone people listened to. But now she wasn't a leader or a senior flight attendant. She was just a headline, a cautionary tale, and a name people would talk about in the break rooms. Her phone rang again, another news update. Melora didn't check it. Instead, she felt small for the first time in years, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She turned and walked away from the corporate office, her steps slower. The Langford estate was more empty than it had ever been in 15 years, and she didn't know where she was going next. The ride home was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Aeon and Zavin sat across from their father in the back of the sleek black car. The leather seats were cool under them. Their father hadn't said much since they got off the plane, but he didn't have to. Elon looked at his phone and scrolled through the news. Zavin grinned and kicked his feet up a little. Darius didn't say anything. He didn't say anything right away. He just rested his elbow on the car door and looked out the tinted window. After a long silence, he finally spoke. Are you satisfied? Zavin shrugged. Yeah, she got what she deserved. Darius finally looked at them and asked, what exactly did she deserve? Elian raised an eyebrow. She humiliated us. She didn't even think twice before kicking us off that plane. If you hadn't stepped in, she would have gotten away with it. Darius studied them carefully. That's not what I asked, Zavin said. The car fell silent. To learn, Darius slowly nodded and said, now she has. He leaned back, but his face couldn't be read, but both boys sat up straighter. Darius's voice was steady and deliberate. Power isn't just about what you can take from someone, it's about what you choose to do with it. Zavin frowned and asked, what do you mean? Darius sighed and rolled his shoulders slightly. That woman lost everything today, not because she made it happen, but because she made a choice, and now she's dealing with the consequences. But there's something you should know. Elian leaned forward and asked, "What's that?" Darius looked them in the eyes and said, "You don't need revenge when the truth speaks for itself." There was a moment of silence, and Zaven let out a breath. "So what happens now?" Darius asked. "What happens now?" He looked at his watch and watched as the city lights flickered past. "I already told you," he whispered. "No one should ever have to prove they belong where they already are." Zaven laughed and said, "You should put that on a t-shirt." Elon gave a small smile and said, "Why not?" Darius briefly closed his eyes before answering because he knew that when he opened them again, no one would ever be able to read his expression again. The sun had started to go down, casting long shadows across the city skyline. As Darius Langford's car pulled into the driveway of their estate, the gates opened without a hitch, and the vehicle moved smoothly down the long tree-lined path that led to their home. Everything about their arrival felt normal, calm, and in control. As the car stopped, Elena stretched his arms, and Zaven took a deep breath, finally feeling the energy of the day settle into his bones. It had been a victory, but it came with weight. The three of them got out of the car, and the air was crisp with the distant hum of the city behind them. For the first time in hours, they weren't being watched. No more passengers, no more cameras, no more whispers, just them inside. The smell of cedarwood and fade cologne filled the entryway. Their home was a mix of high ceilings, sleek lines, and a warm atmosphere made this not only a place where business deals were made, but also where they lived. Darius loosened his tie a little and rolled his shoulders. He wasn't usually this tired, but today had been an exception. Today wasn't just about his sons, it had been about something much bigger. Islan and Zaven looked at each other and followed him into the large living room, where Zaven flopped down on the couch to show that she was done right. Elon sat down more slowly, setting the table. "Yeah," he said, "be quieter this time, and I think she knows that too." Darius stood there and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city beyond their home. The lights flickered, cars drove by, and the world went on as usual for everyone else, but for Malora Cartwright, her world had just fallen apart, and he made sure she knew it. Zaven smiled. "I kind of wish I could see her face right now." Darius slowly let out a breath. "What would that change?" Zaven blinked. What did Darius finally look at? If he saw her face and saw her feel bad about what she did, wouldn't that make a difference? Zabivan hesitated and shifted slightly in his seat. "I mean, it'd just be satisfying," he said. "That's all." Darius laughed quietly to himself and then sat down across from them. "You think what happened today was about satisfaction?" Ellen asked, leaning forward with her elbows on his knees. "It was about correction." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Was it Ellen didn't back down?" "She had power. And she used it to make us feel like we didn't belong. You made sure she knew she was the one who didn't belong." Darius looked at his son for a long time before answering, "You're not wrong." Zaven crossed his arms and asked, "Then what's the problem?" Darius sighed and ran his hand over his jaw. "The problem is that if all you take from this is the satisfaction of seeing someone fall, then you haven't learned anything at all," he said in a steady voice. "What else were we supposed to learn?" Darius leaned forward. The room went silent as Darius continued, "You'll go through life and people will judge you before they know you. They'll assume things about you. They'll underestimate you. They'll try to push you into corners where you have to prove yourself." His voice dropped a little. "You'll be questioned in rooms where you should be leading. You'll be looked at like an outsider in places where you belong." Zaven and Elia listened carefully now, and yes, Darius admitted that sometimes those people will get. He looked out the window again before turning back to them and saying, "That's not what makes you powerful. What makes you powerful is the choice you make after you've won." Zaven sat back and thought, "So what? We just forgive her?" Darius gave a small, quiet smile. "You don't have to forgive her," he said, "but you don't have to carry her with you either." Elian took that in and slowly nodded. "We move forward." Darius nodded, yes. Zovan clicked his tongue, so no victory dance. You can celebrate, but don't let your happiness turn into pride. Zovan rolled his eyes and grinned nicely. Darius leaned back in his chair. Now tell me, what did you learn today? Elon asked. People like her never think they're wrong until they have to face it. Darius nodded. Good. Zovan leaned forward and said, we don't need to prove we belong. Darius smiled a little better. Alone sat up straighter. The best revenge is letting the truth do the work for you. Eris smiled fully. Zovan moaned, why do you always make things so philosophical? Darius laughed, the sooner you understand how the world works, the sooner you learn how to navigate it. Elon stood up and stretched his arms. I don't know about you, but I need food. Zovan jumped up after him. Oh yes, we deserve the best dinner ever for today's performance. Darius stood there shaking his head as his sons walked toward the kitchen. Arrogance, he muttered with amusement. No dad confidence, Zovan turned around with a smile. We'll see. The city outside their walls kept moving through the night, and the world kept turning. Today had been about justice, power, and a lesson that would not be forgotten. As the Langfords ate dinner, the world outside was still talking, but none of them had to say a word because the message had already been sent. If you liked this story, please hit the like button and let us know what you thought in the comments below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. I'll see you in the next one.